listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite, and I work with some phenomenal people, about 150 of them at a place called Blue Door. The good people who are bringing you this podcast. What do we do at Blue Door? Man, how long do we have? Not that long. So check us out at bluedoor.ca. You'll see all the wonderful work we're doing in housing, health, and meaningful and well-paid employment opportunities to prevent and end homelessness and put a stop to poverty. Check us out at bluedoor.ca. Listen, if you have an idea for this podcast, you yourself would like to be a guest, really what we center this podcast around is we look at different people in this sector, what they're doing, the work they're doing, where we can learn and grow from, the challenges they're facing, how they're overcoming those. If you're one of those people, hey, reach out to me at michael.b@bluedoor.ca. Come to our website, bluedoor.ca, contact us there. Or if you know of someone, or if you have feedback and you're saying, love this podcast because, or didn't like this podcast, or what I'd really like to see, michael.b@bluedoor.ca. And we have a wonderful guest today, just like, I don't know, the energy from our guest today was incredible. So today we have Trina Prince, and they are the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and they a well-known advocate in this work. And we have a great conversation about their advocacy work, their approach to advocacy and teaching and helping others understand that. And we talk about a workshop that they run, and it starts with oops, and it really kind of opens up. It's kind of a non-fearful approach to discussions and having people talk about the issues that matter, really without fear of messing up. Right? I love that approach to advocacy. We talk about what's happening in the world right now. Trina's great about saying, look, this work around EDI didn't start in 2020, it just got magnified through the pandemic. And there's been people for years pushing and doing this work. And unfortunately, now we've seen some backlash, a little bit from the States, also across Canada, where the work around EDI, some people are putting a pause on it. And we talk about that and what has to be done to change that, how we can work together to make sure that EDI continues to be on the front burner across our nation. We talk about also how we can stop the harm that our country has caused our Indigenous communities, how we all have to come together and make it a priority and work with elders and our Indigenous communities to make sure, even though the Liberal government has talked about some of the strides they've made, we have to get past that good enough. That's what I talk about, is that we have to get past checking a box and we have to do more, right? Because too many Indigenous communities are still without the necessities of life, without dignified, affordable housing, running water, and that kind of thing. We have to continue to push and work together as a country to stop that. We also talk about their journey into this work, of course, and a really cool answer to the first question that we asked, of course, is what home means to you. Trina is wonderful, they're brilliant, and I think you'll really enjoy the conversation. So let's go to that conversation now. Trina, a delight to have you here. Thanks so much for making time today.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here.
We ask everyone the same question, comes on the show because it's different for everyone. And that question is, what does home mean to you?
Oh, and I love this question. I think it's very personal, right? Because everyone's going to have different answers. And I was really thinking about this. And for me, I think it's around safety. I think there's so much when it comes to, like, home can be a place, it can be with people, it can be, sitting by the ocean. But I think it's, where do you feel like you belong? Where do you feel like you've been seen? And where do you feel safe? And then that's a lot of things, right? Like, a lot of us, to feel safe, there's a lot of needs that we need met. And it's stuff that everyone should have access to: food, a roof over our heads, people to talk to, and people to see us as we are. And I think all of that's really important. So that's kind of what home is for me, is a place where you feel safe, where you feel seen, where you can be yourself. For me, I have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And so home also means for me that I have access to soap and clean water and a space that, is safe for me. I have autism, so it's a place where I can unmask, where I can just be my goofy, free self, and not worry too much about having to put on this, society's expectation of the way I respond to things or think about things. It's a place where I can cuddle up with my cats. I think it's, when you ask what is home, there's such a duality to it. And there's so many steps to what that might be. But yeah, I think for everybody, we all deserve a place where we feel safe and where we belong.
Love it. And couldn't agree more. I think, your guard never comes totally down until you shut that door, and everyone deserves that door, that key to their front door. You've had an incredible journey to, your comfort level. Can you share a little bit, walk us through some of the journey in your life to where you are now?
Yeah, for sure. There's so many aspects to, okay, where am I? Like, who am I and how do I get here? And all those pieces. I think I will start, because folks are always kind of interested, like, what do I do? And so I'm very fortunate to be the director of equity, diversity, and inclusion in our Office of Equity and Inclusive Communities at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, which is a post-secondary in the Lower Mainland in what we call British Columbia. It's quite a journey to get. Folks are always asking, how do you get into equity and inclusion work? What does that mean? What does that look like? And I think for me, it started right from a young age, where I was someone who experienced a lot of bullying for a number of years. And afterwards, through all of that, I learned, I always want folks to feel like they have a space to belong, where they feel joy, where they feel safe to be in grief, where they can just be themselves. And because I didn't have that for a number of years, and that kind of continued to lead me into the work. And then I think during my undergrad at Nipissing University, I really got involved in kind of advocacy when it comes to human rights in a lot of different ways, for the 2S LGBTQI plus community, around mental health, around raising awareness around ending gender-based violence. A lot of these pieces really came into play. I was so fortunate to be on our student union, so I got to talk to students and hear, like, what do you need in order to enjoy your time at this university? And so if that was helping supporting behind the scenes in like some sort of like group or club, or having an event, or doing a fundraiser, I really got actively involved in a lot of ways during my undergrad. And then when I moved out west, I joined as a volunteer Solal Sexual Violence Support Center, and they do an 11-week intensive anti-oppression training for their volunteers. And this is where I think I truly learned so much. This is going on 10 years ago now, really taking a deep anti-oppression lens to the world around me, and really understanding my privileges, and also how I live my life, and where I need to be advocating, not just for, my lived experiences, but also for all the people around me. And then moving forward, that's when I really, truly brought it into my work that I was doing. I worked in alumni services. I worked in event management. And then when jobs started popping up around equity, diversity, and inclusion, that's when I started to apply. And then that's kind of what led me to KPU. But really it's just a passion for supporting others. I want folks to have safe spaces, as safe as possible, wherever they go. And specifically my love for education, I think is so important, but we need to be using education in the right way. And so I want folks to feel safe when they're receiving their education and coming to post-secondary.
Amazing. And agree. You are widely known for your advocacy work for trans, two-spirit, queer, and disabled individuals. What are you seeing these days, and what change is needed in your work?
So I want to fully acknowledge so that we do a lot of amazing work within our office, and the two portfolios that kind of sit within my area is gender and sexual equity and disability justice and accessibility. However, I can't do that work without an intersectional lens, and I want to fully honor that right from the get-go. We can't end one form of oppression without ending all forms of oppression. That's a quote by Rachel Ricketts, who I just absolutely love her work. And it's so true. We really, really can't. And I think that's kind of a crucial piece that I always like to mention. And I'm so fortunate that, our office is doing amazing work around anti-racism and social sustainability. We partner very closely with our indigenous leadership team, and I am always learning from them about ways to bring decolonization and reconciliation to the work that we're doing as well. And so, keeping that in mind when we're talking about rights for trans, two-spirit, and queer folks, as well as for folks with disabilities, there's so much work that still needs to be done. And I think there's a few key things that we can all do to really move this work forward. One thing that I talk about, and I have a workshop called Oops, the Power of Making Mistakes. And I think we have to be so open to being comfortable with making mistakes. I think the reason why a lot of folks don't want to have conversations or lean into and learn more about different cultures, different ways of being, different, is that they're so nervous that they're going to mess up. And the truth is they're going to. I do it all the
100%.
time.
100%.
And as a recovering people pleaser myself, it's hard. You don't want to mess up because you're worried about hurting another human. But the thing is if you can do it with humility and accountability, people are going to see that you're trying, and people are going to see that you're learning from it. I truly believe we'll continue to make the same mistakes until we've learned to do better. I think that's so important and so crucial. I do think accountability can be such a strong way that we can advocate for rights across the board. And instead of sitting in that shame, really just be like, ooh, I feel bad. How can I turn this into a good thing in a learning moment versus anything else? And I think that's a really good starting point for when we're doing anti-oppression work. And don't be afraid to go into spaces and go learn from folks. There's so many wonderful works out there, whether you're on different socials, follow folks from community who, are sharing their lived experiences and talking and sharing their knowledge and their teachings. When you can attend conferences, that may be from a different lens, so you can hear and learn from folks. Watch shows. It can be fiction, nonfiction, watch TV shows, read a book, from experiences of people with disabilities or from folks who are part of the 2S LGBTQI+ community. There's so much opportunity and learning out there, and we live in such a rich world that find something that you love, like I mentioned, crafts, books, movies, sports, and look into it and find out ways to interact with different communities so that you have a space where you can do that learning. And I think it just enriches, the world in such a cool way.
Yeah, I love that, and I love what you talked about. I love the title, the "Oops." I'll tell you, years back, I remember we were doing some training with our team, and we had a group in, and we had a woman on our team who's probably in her 60s, and she was really trying hard. She said, "This is all new. I'm learning," and she said, that, and she was talking about. She said, I think the words were the sex she was born with. And the trainer jumped all over her and said, assigned at birth and just and shamed her almost. And she and it was great because the other trainer said, no, let's take a step back. So there's a learning environment, and and this person's open to it. Just had no idea. But if you and I I'm not to put words in your mouth, but I just think if you push too hard, and this person was saying, educate me, and it was okay. But if you go at people and they're afraid to open their mouth or say so maybe she won't contribute anymore or try anymore because the fear is there. If you take away that fear, and again, if people are always open to and wanting to learn, and I've seen that throughout, as we in the world of homelessness too. I remember a fire chief who was in his 60s said to me, I'm just wrapping my head around 2S LGBTQ plus different pieces, but help me understand trans. And I was the wrong, I can't, but let me help you. Let me introduce you to, and open, right? Open. And I think he was like watching every word he said because he didn't want to say the wrong thing. And I get it. But I love that openness that you talk about for people, especially when people are saying, I want to learn, I want to be better, I want to know more.
And I agree with that. I think we're seeing such polarization right now when it comes to, creating safer spaces for everybody and for really, doing equity and inclusion work. And yet at the same time, I think with that polarization, I just think it's because it's so loud. But I truly believe that majority of people in this world want to do the best that they can. But we also live in a world that centers perfectionism, that centers either or thinking, and that really puts people into this space where they feel so scared to mess up. And so when we do have these spaces where folks are willing to be so open, or just like leaning into it a little bit, we do have to meet them where they're at. And we do have to, because those are the folks that want to do better. And every little piece that you can share kind of help folks go, okay, I can understand how to do these pieces. And if we stop, if we create the space where, learning is just so welcomed, I think it's just going to create safer spaces, truly, because then folks can feel like they can have these conversations and be open about it. And I also do think when it comes to advocacy, like there's different, we do need the folks who are going to disrupt and, tell people like this is the way that it has to be. But we also need the weavers. And I'm using obviously indigenous teaching language in that, but like we need the folks who are going to be able to weave people together from different backgrounds and bring folks together and help folks see and understand. And that I think is the way that I approach advocacy work, is where I was like, how can I help you understand where I'm coming from, and more importantly, how can I understand what you need and how I can create a safer space for you to help with this learning, and then also I'm going to learn from you too. And I think that's kind of such a beautiful way to walk through this world.
I can recall back when we started at meetings, saying we're going to go around and use our preferred pronouns. And I mean, honestly, some of those people around who had, without talking about why and why we're doing this and some of the looks of fear around that table, especially in smaller communities, were like, what are you talking about? What's happening here? I don't understand why we're doing this. And if there's so the fear of messing up once it got to them, right? So I love that approach to advocacy. Let's talk a little bit about you. And I think when we look at experience, what you bring to the table, a large part for you is lived experience. How has that lived experience shaped you and your work?
Yeah. So I kind of want to just situate myself. I think it's so important in spaces like this. So first and foremost, I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Semiahmoo, Tiswassen, Kaiket, Kwikwetlem, and Katesli First Nations, as well as the Kwantlen First Nation, which is actually my university is named after. And it's so important to acknowledge the nations whose lands I'm on. I'm an uninvited person on these lands. I'm Polish and I'm German. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that and recognize the privilege I have. Identify as a white, queer, trans, non-binary person. I also identify as someone with a disability, multiple disabilities actually, they're all invisible. So autism, ADHD, and OCD. And I also identify as a smaller fat person. For folks who can't see me, I have short brown hair, pale white skin. I've got glasses on, and I'm wearing a kind of gray black zip up hoodie, and then I've got my office in the background. And the reason I do that, the reason I bring that introduction into when we're talking about lived experience, is because there's so many ways that all of us walk through this world. And within that sharing, there's a lot of privilege, and there's a lot of areas that I also, am advocating for to build safer spaces for my different communities. I think when it comes to my lived experience and kind of the work that I'm doing, is that, again, I can only bring my lens to it. And I think that's what's really important. So when I share my experience as a trans person, that's my experience. And that's the way that I, walk through this world. But then also that creates community. And so I do have safer spaces with other trans folks in space, and I'm on a softball league that's just for queer and trans folks, and that's just so inclusive. And you show up and you get to be yourself, and you know that most likely 90% of the time your pronouns are going to be used. I use they them pronouns, and so things like that. It's kind of a very interesting way of the way that I walk through this world and bring that into the work that I do. And also, I think that lived experience does help me relate to the anti-oppression work that I do. I've experienced a lot of microaggressions through being misgendered, through being assumed of, or not seeing myself in spaces. And I think that I can't understand what it means for folks that have other experiences of oppression, whether that's dealing with racism or dealing with, I don't have a physical disability, so dealing with ableism in other ways, or having your community colonized. Like, that's experiences that I will never have. And at the same time, it does make me want to center those who are most marginalized, to bring them into the center so we can create safer spaces, and just really allow folks to thrive. I do have a lot of privilege when it also comes to, class and in regards to having an education. And, I'm very fortunate that I do have a roof over my head. And I don't think it's fair that we live in a world where folks don't have access to shelter, and not just shelter, that comes back to the first question, but a place that they can call their own, where at the end of the day, you walk in the door and you're like, oh, okay, I'm home, and this is where I get to be. And I know that's a privilege that I have, and I want to keep fighting for others to have that same, privilege. And that's why, I think that lived experience of both having privilege in spaces and also having this experience of feeling oppression in other spaces, how can I bring that intersecting experiences to help others understand and advocate for creating a better world for everybody? Does that kind of answer the question?
100%. No right or wrong.
Yeah.
Love it. Right or wrong. It's you and your lived experience, and it's so evident in everything you do. So diversity, equity, inclusion work across Canada, around the world. I think for a while we were seeing huge steps. People were understanding it. People were investing in it. Companies were hiring people. Blue Door's done that. We have a manager who really, and what we've seen, incredible work from that. However, in the last little while, what we've seen is a bit of pushback, especially in the States. We've seen at Toronto Pride Parade, which I believe is the second largest in the world, has lost some sponsors due to people saying this no longer is a priority. It's not, and we've seen that through kind of the government in the U.S. with among many crazy things that are happening right now. What are your thoughts around all this kind of work? What are you seeing, and what needs to kind of change moving forward? What are your worries?
Yeah, and it's such a big question, because it's something that we're continuously asking, right? Where we see this movement of EDI move forward. I truly do think, so many folks are doing this work and have been doing this work for, hundreds of years. Like, I first want to acknowledge that, this advocacy work is not just starting, it isn't just new since 2020. It's always been worked on. But I think what happened because of the pandemic, people had to stop and they had to pay attention. And it was making folks go, hang on a second, we're experiencing a crisis, but also in this crisis, we're recognizing other crises that are happening. We saw a surge of folks supporting the unhoused. We saw a surge of folks, fighting back against anti-Black racism. We saw folks really recognizing and confirming, the residential schools and all the children in the graves, unmarked graves. And all of these pieces made folks go, okay, we have to do more to do better. And I think that was such an important piece, but it felt so short-lived, because I think some folks felt overwhelmed by it. I think a lot of folks felt that no matter what they did, they weren't going to get it right. And again, it's that fear of messing up, so they just don't want to touch it. And then now that we've got a few very loud people in unhealthy spaces of power, it's giving permission to people to push back extremely heavily. So you're seeing blatant racism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, just really out there. And nothing really seems to be being done. But a couple things I want to remind folks is that this work has always been worked on, whether like EDI, like I said, it didn't start in 2020. EDI has truly been moving forward for years. We can go back to the civil rights. We can go back to even before that. Folks have always been advocating, for rights of different groups. But I think what we need to understand is we do have to continue to be talking about this and can't be afraid to be doing it. I've been saying I'm very privileged being in BC right now. We have a provincial government that is not shutting down EDI departments, and yet we're seeing that happen in other places in the country. And not just in the States, it's also happening in provinces in Canada. And so I'm like, okay, while we're in this position, how can we keep doing this work? And also when they finally tell us, if I'm assuming they're going to eventually, I'm hoping not, but if they tell us to stop this work, we're going to keep doing it. And how do we keep doing it? And how do we make this as sustainable as possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Right? We live in a world now where how we share information is so much different, and that it doesn't matter anymore. Like, I mean, the truth or facts or well-written articles, it's slogans and little bits and pieces, and people believe and take what someone says as the truth and run with it. So, I mean, COVID was a perfect example of access and equity. It wasn't fair, right? The people that suffered the most were our most vulnerable populations, right? Black and Indigenous populations, people experiencing homelessness because of that access to healthcare and access to housing and access to all these different things, right? So we see it, and we just want to, there's some momentum here, and I don't want to see us lose this when we're doing good things and making strides, right? So with people like yourself leading the charge and many others, I think we can do that, and let's have our voices heard. That goes to everyone in our sector. We do have a federal election coming up now. By the time this airs, we'll have a new government. At this point, as you and I talk, it looks like, if we believe the polls, it's going to be a Liberal government. And so over the last 10 years, we've had a Liberal government. Liberal government has talked about in its campaigning the strides that they have made with Indigenous communities, but also saying there's much more to be done. I would love to get your thoughts on this, on what the work that's been done so far, and moving forward as a country. What can we do? What do we need to do to stop the harm to Indigenous communities?
Mm-hmm. I think it's everyone's job to do this. And at the same time, I think the government has ongoingly dropped the ball on this. I don't know if that's an appropriate saying to say, but I truly believe that there's so much more that we can be doing. And to me, it needs to be because everybody's shown that they care about it. I do think this work cannot be done without centering Indigenous folks and their voices. So we have to be listening. But also, I think sometimes I get a lot of folks saying, oh, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can consult with, our local nations. And I think you need to be working on that. You always have to be working on that. Also, we know our local nations, a lot of them are inundated with, requests. And at the same time, we have phenomenal roadmaps that Indigenous people have created for us to work off of. So the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, there's 94 of them. Almost every sector is represented within these calls to action, and there's a roadmap for us to work on within those calls to action. So we do have a space to start that is centering Indigenous voices, because this was created by Indigenous people. And so those 94 calls to action, I think, are so important. We also have the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Two-Spirit calls to justice. There's 231 of those. Again, roadmaps. We have these very detailed, specific ways that we can, within every, organization, every institution, every company, nonprofit, even softball league, my team's looking at it. We're like, how can we implement some of these calls to action, these calls to justice that are readily here for us to move forward with? And also, how do we continue to advocate and push back at government and say, you have a roadmap. Why are these things not being done? It's been 10 years, right? The TRC was released in 2015, and 12 to 14 different sites say different numbers right now, but only 12 to 14 are complete of the 94. That seems too little for me in a 10-year period. So I do think there needs to be, and it's not just about completing these calls to action. It's truly about centering decolonization, and supporting our Indigenous communities. None of our Indigenous communities, like, we know that there's such a high rate amongst Indigenous communities, especially urban Indigenous communities that are dealing with, being unhoused, or having access to clean water, or, as I mentioned, there's a high rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And that's just completely unacceptable. And there should be no reason this is happening. And that number is still rising. And yet we've had 6 years with our calls to justice. So I think people need to take the time, and it should be mandatory that, for everyone who lives in what we call Canada, it has to be dedicated to this work, and it has to be built into the framework of professionally what we do, but also, I think, for me personally, really understanding, what are these pieces that we can implement, and again, continuing to uplift the Indigenous voices that we have around us. And I'm so fortunate that I've had so many, and I still do have phenomenal teachers and knowledge keepers and elders that, will sit and have conversations and are so willing to give us the tools to do this work and center their communities. And so I just think, take the time to do that and learn and really understand.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think in our country, sometimes I say this a lot, and homelessness too. Sometimes we have this kind of good enough framework where, like, hey, we house someone for a night on a church floor, like with a cot and whatever, job done. And it's not. It's the same. And sometimes across with Indigenous communities too. Yes, awesome. It's fantastic that we're ending, getting fresh and clean water too. But it can't end there. That's a start, right? And every community deserves beautiful and housing and access to affordable housing and water and all these different things, right, that are human rights. And so many Indigenous communities do not have that. And so until we stand together, as you said, this isn't going to happen. We've made some progress, but we got to get past good enough and get to great and decent and dignified, right? Well, listen, if people want to, you're doing incredible work, and we've only got a short period of time. If people want to find out more about you, what you're doing, what you're up to, where can they go?
You can find me on LinkedIn, just /Trina Prince, just my first and last name, and I'll pop up. Happy to connect with folks there. Also, kpu.ch/OEIC. It's our Office of Equity and Inclusive Communities, OEIC, that has all the details of the work, the events, the resources that the entire team is working on. And that's also a great way to connect. And I'm happy to connect with folks to have conversations and brainstorm ideas and figure out how we can work together, because definitely this work cannot be done, in a silo, and it really is everyone's commitment. And so I'm happy to have conversations.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Trina. Wonderful to talk with you, and so grateful for the work that you're doing in leading. And I just, like, in talking with you, I feel the approachability, and approachability is huge, I think, when you're wanting to help others with advocacy work, and no doubt it's why you're so good at it, and it's been recognized. Thank you so much for your time today, for sharing and caring, and you're always welcome back.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Can I leave with one more little
Of course, yeah.
piece? I was recently at a conference, Moving Trans History Forward conference, hosted by the chair of transgender studies. And there was a youth panel, and the youth were asked, what can we do? What would you do if transphobia didn't exist? And one of the youth said, live. And it's just so crucial. And I think we can approach all areas of depression. Like all of us just want to live. We want to feel grief. We want to feel joy. And so I think I just want to share that little last piece because that was so impactful to me.
It is.
And I think there's so much we can do to help people just live.
Love it. What a great way to end. Thank you so much.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.